It's my privilege now to share a few words of Torah with you this morning. When I was in high school, my sister's house burned down. The first thing I knew about it was Britt and her husband and 3 young kids arriving in our home in the middle of the night, smelling of smoke, eyes tired, faces tight with fear. They were fine, but an electrical fire had started in their rented Lexington house among some cords late at night. My niece had woken up, don't know why, smelled smoke, roused her parents. They grabbed their kids, they grabbed their wallets, they grabbed a few photos, and that was it. Everything else burned. For several weeks, they slept on our beds and living room couches, a paper screen hastily put up for privacy. Their flight from home because of that fire reverberated for decades in our family. It interrupted their school, their work, and regular sleep. It was traumatic. It had intense financial and emotional consequences. And they were lucky. They had us to come to. Like my niece, I too woke up on a late July morning this year to the smell of smoke. Only this smoke came from across the country. This smoke was from the bootleg fire in California, in our Massachusetts air, in my nostrils. The West burned again this summer. Record temperatures, terrible fires. Mid-August, NPR reported on an unprecedented drought in the Colorado River, which will, for I believe the first time ever, force communities along it to begin reducing their water usage. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report in early August, and human activity and pollution have heated our planet up past 1 degree Celsius, with more catastrophic warming still to come. And we feel the effects of this warming already, not just in hotter temperatures and in uncontrollable wildfires. We feel it too in water. Extreme floods, changed rainfall patterns, and droughts. Hurricane Ida just last week killed scores of people from flooding, and thousands remain without power. The hour is late, but it is not too late for meaningful action. Dr. Elizabeth Sawin wrote on Twitter on August 6th, the night before the release of that report. She said, "Repeat after me. Every fraction of a degree of increased global warming averted is suffering, both of human and non-human averted. Just because you cannot stop all suffering is not a reason to not prevent what suffering you can. There is no giving up, my friends," she wrote. Also, there are tipping points in the human heart and collective consciousness that could be just as sudden and just as big as any in the Earth system. Just because the IPCC isn't charged with documenting them does not mean they don't exist, latent, stirring to life. And there is nothing worse than giving up just shy of a tipping point and no way to know how close you might be. So Dr. Sawin wrote, in our liturgy, in our Sidurim, our Machzor, Rosh HaShanah I Uvyom Tzom Kippur Yechatemun. We'll sing those words together again in just a little while, but on Rosh HaShanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed, who by fire and who by water, who by earthquake and who by plague, but teshuvah, restorative action, and tefillah, spiritual self-support, and tzedakah, acts of justice, acts of redistributing precious resources, ma'avirin et roa hagezera. These cause the worst of the decree to pass away. Never has our liturgy been more literally, globally true. We know that climate change is here. We know that we cannot avoid it, but we can avert the worst ravages of the climate change that was decreed by our past relationship with the earth. If we cultivate life-saving, massive global changes in practice, green can grow back through the ash of those fires. A famous midrash in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak in Breshit Rabbah compares Avraham to a man who is journeying and comes across a burning palace. Is it possible that this palace has nobody to look after it? The man asks, whereupon its owner looks out from the palace and says, I am the master of this palace. Similarly, Avraham, seeing the universe, asks, is it possible that the universe lacks a person to look after it? And the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, looks at Avraham and says, I am the master of this universe. Our actions, like God's, can make and can also break life on earth. And we shouldn't abandon a house or a world on fire. We can stay in it and try to make it better. Self-interest and moral obligation walk hand in hand here. Combating climate change is also an issue of social justice. Fire losses disproportionately affect people with fewer resources. That's poor countries and poorer individuals. I remember in 2017, and perhaps you do too, Grenfell Tower, a British apartment block in West London in which mostly immigrant families lived, went up in flames. It was swathed in this cheap external cladding that was being used for construction that wasn't as flame retardant as it should have been. And it caught fire with terrifying speed. There were sprinkler systems inside. They'd been out of order for months. Residents had complained. Nothing had been done. More than 80 people died that night. So safety measures undertaken for poorer people are not always, but are too often inadequate. And as long as the people in power are not directly affected, change is slow. Folks with thin margins of survival are also hit hardest by changes in their environment, in their climate that are beyond their control. Enormous numbers of people are now climate refugees, fleeing from Earth that will no longer support the growing seasons and the crops and the occupations that have traditionally helped them stay alive. Climate change damages national economies, and as a consequence, it's also a national security issue. The World Bank estimated in 2018 that more than 140 million people by 2050 will be forced to move because of environmental factors. And we see it already. Climate refugees flee from Syria, from fields in Honduras and Guatemala that will no longer grow coffee or corn and beans because the earth is hotter and the rains are no longer regular. They flee from more variable and dramatic weather that threatens both family and livestock husbandry in the East and the Horn of Africa, Somalia, the Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Many climate refugees, as we have experienced, end up at the borders of the USA, trying to come in. But our country is not an island, and climate change is here too. It is not a potential issue. It's not a future issue. It's happening right now. And so it needs immediate work to mitigate. And this problem, my friends, can feel as overpowering as God, right? As overpowering as God's self. How do we move this? How do we move this needle? But we have to try. To quote Rabbi Benjamin Franklin on the eve of the American Revolution, we must hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately. Or as the climate prophet Bill McKibben said, the best thing an individual can do right now is to become less of an individual. People who study and combat climate change have been telling us for generations that only a worldwide group effort is going to succeed. This is no longer an individual effort. We have to do this together. And I think of the work of Festivales Solidarios, an environmental activist organization in Guatemala. Their members were attacked with machetes last year while they were trying to prevent illegal logging in a forest. And these folks, these members of Festivales, they know that their survival is not possible without the Earth's health and without mutual worldwide aid and cooperation. Opportunities for communal action are thick on the ground. There is a Jewish organization, Dayenu, specifically dedicated to supporting climate change activism and Jewish neshamot, the souls invested in this work. Its name, Dayenu, means both we've had enough of climate destruction and we are enough for the work of saving humanity. Members of our Temple Social Action Committee are investigating starting a Dayenu Circle, a group of people who will meet monthly to find and share both spiritual support and action opportunities. Social Action Committee member Karen Godek will speak about our Jewish environmental connection and responsibilities this afternoon at Tashlich at 5. And the year to come will bring more opportunities for education and for advocacy. So please talk to me or Karen or another Social Action Committee member if you would like to become part of a Dayenu Circle. We can each become less of an individual by becoming part of the movement to mitigate climate change in whatever ways we are personally able to do. Activism may not be typical for you. As Bill McKibben, speaking on Hebrew College's podcast, said, The earth is outside of her comfort zone, so we must be too. Recycling and taking shorter showers and eating less red meat are all helpful habits. But we're not going to recycle our way out of this one. We can't turn back the clock to prevent dangerous global warming, but we can slow that clock down by urging our governments and our industries to listen carefully to climate scientists and to act immediately on their recommendations. I don't know what all the steps are, right, that the world needs to take, but climate scientists have been studying this for a long time, and they are worth listening to and worth acting on. We can give ourselves more time if we do this to mitigate those effects of what we have already wrought. Both we and the earth need to rest from our human carbon dioxide exuding, resource stripping, planet cooking habits. We need time and we need space to cool down. We need to return to the integrity of air, water, land, and practice that help support life on earth. And Baruch Hashem, thank God, we have a model for this kind of rest and renewal in our Jewish texts. We have the Shemitah year, which begins actually this year in our Jewish calendar. This is the first day of the Shemitah year. Every 7 years, the Torah tells us, you're going to have a year of rest for the land and for the animals, rest from cultivation and rest from labor. Debts are forgiven and things put in pawn are redeemed. This past year of our American Jewish lives, hemmed in by COVID-19 and its restrictions, has been a year of enforced pause, but it hasn't been what I would call fallow. It hasn't been a rest that helps growth. We've all been in survival mode. Shemitah is coming to let us be fallow when we need to most. We need time for the seeds of this year of reckoning have germinated. We have been acting from fear. We've been acting from survival instinct. We've acted from adrenaline rather than from reflection. Our discourses also have lurched towards scorched earth tactics, with people getting angrier and angrier with each other online without that precious hydration of just seeing one another, having a cup of coffee, going for a walk together. So we need more time. And Yom Kippur is called Shabbat Shabbaton by God, this Shabbat of Shabbats. And Shabbat and Shemitah, as you might have guessed, are really intimately related. Shemitah is a longer term version of Shabbat. It's the culmination of a week of years. Shabbat every 7 days, Shemitah every 7 years. One might even say, says Rabbi David Seidenberg, that the purpose of Shabbat is to practice for Shemitah. And so, of course, is Yom Kippur. So if we think about Shabbat as practice for the Shemitah year, there are spiritual practices that Shabbat gives us for living in a world where the climate is changing. When we must at once save what life we can from a burning place while trying to extinguish the fire and at the same time keep up our own spiritual strength, what Jewish tools do we have? We are offered regular practice of rest, connection, and speaking as your cantor, don't be afraid to try prayer in this. We need to make sure that we have what we need without surfeit or waste. The Jewish principle of bal tashchit, don't waste what is growing and what is needful. And sometimes we can even try using less, the way that we fast on Yom Kippur. That can be a practice. Another practice of Shabbat is to stay in community, to ease our hearts by sharing climate concerns and climate action with other people who care about us. We think of Shabbat as a time for rest and abstaining from action, but our need for rest walks hand in hand with our need to preserve life, to band together, to work to put out this fire. The Talmud rules that we cannot work to put out a house fire on Shabbat or even rescue items for it, because Shabbat is more important than saving our stuff. They include even Torah scrolls and other sacred writings. You're not supposed to work to put out a fire, but saving life is more important than refraining from work. And that is where that prohibition evaporates. Rav Chaim ben Eviste ruled that because a fire spreads really quickly from house to house, and every place has elderly and sick people who would have trouble evacuating, any house fire, says Rav ben Eviste, is a life-threatening danger. Therefore, we violate Shabbos and we extinguish any house fire to avoid that potential threat to life. So we're coming up on this is a Shemitah year. This is a Shabbat year. What does that mean for us? It means that just like those homeowners in the Talmud, we acknowledge that this Shemitah year is going to be full of work. urgent and difficult work, trying to work with our neighbors to put out these fires in our collective home, trying to rescue every scrap of living holiness that we can. Too often, humans set ourselves up as masters of this earth. We're not. That Midrash told us we're not the masters of this earth. We are one species living here among the glorious biodiversity that God in all of our texts specifically wants and creates for those other species' own sake. We're not the point of the world. We have the privilege to be part of it. The great Spanish Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, writing more than 900 years ago, wrote that it should not be believed that all the beings exist for the sake of the existence of man. On the contrary, all the other beings too have been intended for their own sakes and not for the sake of something else. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, scientist and author and Native American Potawatomi Nation member, writes in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that what happens to one happens to us all. We can starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. The earth wants to flourish. It will always choose life. Mike and I drove into the east side of Glacier National Park over a decade ago. Acres and acres of trees were burned black from a massive fire, charred and stabbing at the sky as far as I could see. But all around their bases, we saw fresh green life springing back up. Our planet has its own drive to survive. The question for us is, how will we help it? Last Thursday, the weather here changed. Maybe you felt it. Suddenly the air was cooler and drier. I walked down my street and in my nostrils, unmistakably, I smelled New England fall, the season I love best, in the place that I love best. Since I was a child, I've gotten an extra rush of excitement and energy as each fall begins. Crisp motes of leaves and sunshine that touches up every red gold color and hardens the sky's blue. The air smells of plant matter going wet and dormant, and the possibility of harvest. We want our children to breathe in the sense of changing seasons as they grow up, not the smoke of a burning world. And we have no time to waste. We can do this. We are a people, we're a species who survived and rebuilt after the flood. If our world and we seize this moment, we may beat down this fire too and co-create the livable future we all desire. In the fallow opportunity of this Shemitah year, let's redeem the future that we have placed in pawn by prioritizing human consumption and dominance rather than contribution and humility. May each one of us find our practical and spiritual niche in the earth-wide ecology of survival and help life in this world flourish for ourselves and the generations of humans and other living beings yet to come. And together we say, Ken Yehi Ratzon. Shana Tova.